Hello there, David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms, and this is episode 2 of Ask a Schizo. And as with the previous episode, I prepared 3 questions, and the main sort of topic is surrounding the narratives or the description or like the idea of what it is to be schizophrenic in general. So, yeah. I've got 3 questions prepared, and then we'll see again how things move forward depending on what comes up throughout the other discussions of questions. So here we go. Okay, so question 1. What are the 2 distinct narratives that surround your experience of schizophrenia? So roughly put, there's that I either am schizophrenic or that I'm not. So they're kind of the easiest way to outline it, basically. So there's either believing in the experiences I'm having as having some sort of factual or actual basis in reality, and then there's the belief that it's all just a malfunction of the brain, and they don't always cross-correlate. There's not necessarily a middle ground between those 2 things. So in regards, the narrative number 1, shall we say, which is the schizophrenia narrative, theoretically everything I experience that is supernatural or has its basis in alternate realities or visions or the visionary state or anything like that is purely a malfunction of the brain. It's a crossed wire somewhere, a damaged neural pathway or collection of neural pathways that then generates nonsense in my brain. As far as I'm aware, there's no actual like scientific basis for that. There's no like, I don't know, I've never come across any scientific evidence that suggests that anything other than how these ideas are presented, if you see what I mean. So someone might say something that's objectively not true because of a delusion. So I think I'm pretty much in agreement that delusional thinking and that kind of like misapprehension of reality at a fundamental level or extreme paranoia about things, that adds credence to the schizophrenia argument, basically. Because if it's something that's measurably, objectively not true and is clearly a delusion, then you can say that that's a malfunction of a thought process or a malfunctioning thought form or an idea that is based on fundamentally inaccurate information and thus objectively not true. So that's sort of the schizophrenia narrative where I fall in line with it, because I've definitely suffered delusions and I've definitely been at the point where like I've thought something was real that wasn't just not real to me but was objectively not real, and measurably the opposite or something completely different was the case. So that adds credence to that argument. And then the other argument is that at some level of my experience, my schizophrenia symptoms are skills or abilities or unpleasant gifts, I guess you would say. So it's so leading on from the original idea, if it's all a malfunction of the brain, that leads that if that's not the case, then obviously some of it must be based in something, some novel phenomena. So you could maybe separate that into 2. So you could have novel phenomena whereby it's not objectively, so you got the non-objectively real but subjectively real, like visions and hallucinations and seeing deities and interacting with stuff that no one outside of that person can objectively or measurably say that that's not real, because they don't have any tools with which to ascertain whether that's real or not. And then you've got the things that sort of fall in the middle ground of like, okay, what am I trying to say? So like, yeah, hold on, let me come back to this thought. I'll be back in. Okay, so I just had to have a quick review of what I was saying. So we're still answering the above question, what are the 2 distinct narratives, but I'm gonna refrain from making an association where I go, this is the 3rd middle line of it, which is what I was about to do. Now I've checked the video, that's sort of what I was suggesting. But at the moment we're talking about the 2 distinct narratives. So we got the one that it's completely a malfunction of the brain. It's an aberrant mental process or an inaccurate mental process, or brain damage or something like that that leads you to experience things that are objectively and subjectively not real. So that's schizophrenia in a nutshell almost. Then the alternate end of the spectrum is that all of these things are real, and that in my case, if I was to believe everything that I was presented with in my hallucinations, I would believe I was some sort of telepathic being, or some sort of shamanic being, or some sort of I had some sort of extra cognitive abilities, or psi abilities, or psychic abilities, or so on and so forth, and that everything I experience has some basis in some fundamental alternate reality that other people aren't privy to. So that's the other distinct narrative, because there may be middle ground, which we'll come to in a second, but there's not necessarily common ground, because you can't say that, oh, these experiences are, well, you can, this is what I'm going to get to at the common ground bit, but for example, these experiences are just fantasy, just made up and subjectively the only place they even exist. That's sort of the schizophrenia narrative, whereas the other narrative is that these things are objectively relevant in other levels of reality, so they're not necessarily objectively measurable as in everyone else can experience them, but then I come across people that do experience the same things, and it's commonalities of experience, and it makes me think like we need to be more in the middle, because like I said earlier, like there's delusions where you go, okay, here's an inaccurate piece of information, and then you build a whole meaning structure on it, and then that meaning structure is fundamentally flawed and invalid, which is what a delusion is. And it's, the way to separate that is to go, okay, so there's not, because I said there's two distinct narratives that surround it. And in fact, actually, we'll move on to question two, because this sort of explains it, what I'm going with, before I move further on. So I'll come back to that in just 1 second. So on to question two. Which of the narratives seem the most plausible and why? So we're still looking at them as parallel narratives, or distinct narratives, or separate narratives. We're not going to address the commonalities. I've separated that for a separate question area. But which of the two narratives seem the most plausible and why? And the most plausible, that's a really hard thing to ascertain, because there's not really much data on it as far as I'm aware. So for example, I heard recently that one of the most common experiences in neurology, when you look at people's brains that have got the brains of people with schizophrenia, they exhibit similar shapes and damage and brain damage and inhibitions and extrahibitions, whatever the word is for that. So the aggravation of different parts of the brain, and larger parts in some areas, smaller parts in others, as someone who's suffered child abuse or violence or a very traumatic upbringing or things like that. But other than that, as far as I'm aware, there's no real. They say it's like a genetic basis, for example. There's the first thing. Like, apparently there's a genetic basis for developing schizophrenia. I've never seen a single piece of evidence for that. I mean, if you have, I want to know about that, so please leave a comment or a link to the data, because that'd be really handy. But apparently the genetic predisposition is more of an analysis of social structure in regards to your family, and like if someone in your family has it, you're more likely to develop it, but they haven't actually identified genes associated with that, as far as I'm aware, that actually back up that information. It's more of a speculative or epigenetic change, like you're more likely to experience it because someone else in your family has it, for example. But again, so in regards to the feasibility of schizophrenia, so the explanations they give for what I'm driving at is that with every other area of schizophrenia, these are unanswered questions or non-evidence based suppositions. Like, it's weird. So like schizophrenia itself is suggested to be, so it's categorized, it's a big umbrella term, right? But it doesn't necessarily, there's no real like physical evidence of it, other than things that are associated with other experiences. So like we know that, for example, childhood trauma can make you more predisposed to schizophrenia. We know that, and there's evidence for that, and you can see it in neurology. There's physical evidence of that, but I don't know that there's any evidence that the genetic predisposition has anything to do with it, other than you're more likely to, other than the environmental reaction to that genetic predisposition. So I don't know about that. In regards evidence that schizophrenia is a dopamine regulation issue, they know that antipsychotics, which were originally designed as a chemical lobotomy, essentially regulate dopamine, and that's how it works. That's how the drug works, but it's sort of inferred rather than being like, hold on, let me come back to this. I'll be back. So again, I had to have a little break and just reassess what I was saying. But yeah, my essential point was that the scientific narrative surrounding schizophrenia, you get these novel phenomena that occur and these different experiences that occur in people that are then labelled with an umbrella term of schizophrenia, but it's so wide and varied and overwhelming that the actual plausibility of schizophrenia in terms of being an objective reality is limited at the moment, because I don't think even the finest minds studying it know, there's no cure for it. They don't know how to fix it. They don't know what the actual problem is, in the physiological basis for it. So they can't fix it with medications. And there's good attempts, but you can't. There's no known cure, and there's a reason for that. So that's the one edge of the schizophrenia diagnosis or label that makes it seem implausible. The other thing that makes it seem plausible is that a lot of the treatment methods for it in terms of psychology or psychotherapy or reintegrative dialogues or cognitive behavioural therapy or various other things that you use to treat schizophrenia, and even the medication themselves, which although it's sort of look of the draw of how much effect you get from antipsychotics, and it's entirely variable, they do effectively make the symptoms easier to manage. They don't eradicate the symptoms, which is why I say there's no real neurological basis for it. But at least they alleviate some of the worst parts of the symptoms, or make it easier to effectively. So they make it so you don't care that you're having the experience, which is a good thing, because that's what makes it more navigable. Because I don't think you can really just turn off schizophrenia, especially if it is an environmentally developed thing. You've learned that behaviour, and it usually comes from heightened exposure to trauma and extreme situations anyway. So that's addressing narrative one, the flaws in narrative one. Now the flaws in narrative two, of course, is that psychic perceptions aren't always accurate, basically. And you have to train and practice until these things become good, unless they're happening to you spontaneously. And then, do you see what I mean? It's not measurably repeatable in other people unless you have these situations spontaneously occur in your psyche, like I do. And even then, I still get false positives. I still get inaccurate perceptions, or things that at least on face value seem inaccurate or are counterintuitively accurate, but then destroy the whole process of development because I don't know how to express or discuss that properly. And also, of course, if I was genuinely psychic, there is also the doubt and the flaw in that narrative of I would probably be more successful with it, if you see what I mean. It would benefit me in some way. Although, again, as a wise friend of mine said to me, it's sort of paraphrasing something I said to him, but making it more eloquent, was that if someone actually genuinely was psychic, as is my experience, it would be pretty unpleasant range of experiences, and you wouldn't get these sort of TV charlatan psychics going around using quite transparent thought reading techniques like cold reading and just fishing for answers and all these kind of very obviously not psychic things that are just mentalism or even in a lot of the cases with people like Psychic Sally and stuff, it's just they're just cold reading and they're not very good at it. But people don't know these techniques, so they don't recognise it. Like I'm aware of these techniques, and that's what makes it easier for me to go, okay, when something happens that's genuinely not one of these techniques, like I don't have any kind of perfectionism in that. I think that if you won't learn how people deceive people, that means that you do you see what I mean? It doesn't make it. If anything, it validates the genuine psychic experiences more to know that I'm not using a deceptive technique to achieve that goal, or not deluding myself. I haven't just picked up this habit or behaviour through observation and then repeating it without any conscious involvement. But that's some of the potential flaws in the belief that the psychic stuff is real, is that it's not always accurate and it requires effort to keep it accurate, and that a lot of the people that corroborate your stories or have similar experiences with the psychic dialogue of things are basically full of shit. And it's not, wow, lightning, that was amazing. Don't know if you saw that on the video. Oh, badass. Dun dun dun. That was fucking cool. Yeah, so there's flaws in both sides of the argument, but the one I'd say that seems the most plausible, paradoxically based on what I was just saying, is the telepathic, psychic kind of level of things. But I think that it requires quite a level of intellectual self-honesty to figure out what are the genuinely psychic experiences, and you have to really, really, really work hard to not be full of shit, basically, not believe your own bullshit. And then once you do that, you realise there are some genuine psychic experiences, there are some genuine telepathic experiences in the midst of your susceptibility to suggestion and things like this. And that's when you start to learn about hypnosis and stuff like this. You realise that there is some sense of magic in it, and there's also some sense of stage magic as well that you need to eradicate before you can really do genuine stuff. So that's, yeah, there's both sides of it. I've talked about these things probably on both regards quite extensively, so I'll come back with question 3 in. So question 3 is, which explanation, if either, is the most objectively measurable and why? This, as has been the rest of the video, is quite a tricky question to answer, because the explanation that I'm schizophrenic is the easiest to measure, because there's so much more data on people that are schizophrenic than there are people that are genuinely psychic, if you see what I mean. So there's plenty of evidence to suggest that both perspectives are false, and that both perspectives are true. So I guess I wouldn't really know how to answer this question, but I wrote this before I'd gone into the rest of the chat on the video. But the one that's most measurable objectively is schizophrenia. So which is why I still allow that term, and I still take the meds, I still accept it, because the treatment methods they've used to help me cope with the experiences are effective. There's lots of things they've done that are ineffectual. There's lots of things I've had to do personally which have been more effective than traditional forms of psychiatric treatment. But in general, like the medication, for example, whether it's just through luck of the draw or random experimentation over the past 200 years of psychiatric medication, it does what it needs to do, or it helps with the scenario of not being able to manage the experiences. And I wouldn't stop taking it if you held a gun to my head and made me do it, because fuck that. I'd like to withdraw slowly over time from it eventually if I deem that necessary, but the fact that the problematic sides of it can be dealt with better through the use of the medications and the techniques that they use suggests to me that it's the most objectively measurable. But it's really hard to know what is a genuine psychic experience, because like if you look into the field of noetics or all these kind of new studies of like psychic phenomena and stuff like this, or Rupert Sheldrake is a really good example. Like there's also objectively measurable versions of that, but it's just not very commonly accepted science. So yeah, it's enormously difficult to say which is objectively true, which is essentially what I'm asking with this question. Measurable denotes truth. So if you can't measure that you're psychic effectively, if you can't repeat that process, if you can't make it accurate, if you can't be good at it, then it's not measurable, because it's just random phenomena. But that's a limit of the process of objective measuring from a scientific perspective, so that's a limit inherent to the question I'm asking, I guess. So I'm going to move on to question 4 now, so I'll be back in un momento. So, question 4 is there a common ground that unifies both narratives? And yes, there is. And that common ground lies in the fact that people get diagnoses of schizophrenia all the time and aren't necessarily under that umbrella. And on the other side, there's people with schizophrenia that never get a diagnosis. And it's all about how you cope with it. It's all about how you manage the experience. Because in my case, regardless of whether I'm psychic or schizophrenic, the fact that whatever those experiences or labels are describing was overwhelming to the point where I can't function normally in society. Thus, we can take from that there's obviously some validity to that it is a mental illness or an illness or a sickness or a problematic kind of process, or that it's unmanageable, and thus external intervention is required to help mediate the process of either being psychic or schizophrenic, or whichever side I put them on. And that is kind of the common ground. There's a common narrative as well, which is that regardless of whether it's psychic or schizophrenic, so whether it's completely made up or not made up at all, but the thing that unifies it is that how these experiences present themselves. So you see things that aren't there, you hear things that aren't there, you feel things that can't necessarily be felt by most people, you have all these continuing experiences. And yeah, so schizophrenia, I would say, is the kind of the unifying narrative in a weird way, because it's not saying this stuff is made up, or labeling it as a mental illness suggests that it's not that these phenomena are real or aren't real. That's not really the question. The question is whether you can manage them, whether you can cope with them. Are these healthy experiences? Are you digesting them correctly and appropriately? And that's kind of the common ground. Is like how do you manage that? And for me, it's with a kind of weird cognitive dissonance. It's like, so I'm psychic, okay, psychic, I hear things, I see things, blah 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 blah. I'm also schizophrenic in that I can't deal with them, and these are negatively toned things that affect my mental health and inhibit my ability to function in reality. And then they unify. That is my common ground. That is my experience of what these things really are and what they mean. So that was question 4. And yeah, so that is the common ground. Is how well you deal with these things, how well you cope with them, how well you process them. So yeah, I'll think that's pretty much it for this episode, but I should be back with a sort of parting closing statement for you once I've reviewed the footage. So yeah, that's been episode 2 of Ask a Schizo, and for as much as I waffled on, I've watched through the video a little bit, and it's kind of discongruent and a bit scatterbrained and a bit crazy, but it's because it's a subject that is difficult for me to navigate internally, so it's hard to talk about with any kind of clarity. But the basic summary of it all is that it could be real, could not be real, but the basis of how you unite these things and learn to manage them better is accepting that the techniques for managing these experiences on both sides are valuable, and having a healthy skepticism towards experiences of being psychic, for example, in my case, that I know in my intuition are objectively real. Having some skepticism towards that helps me navigate the difficulties that I face trying to integrate that into daily life, and also vice versa from the schizophrenia perspective. That having a bit more openness to the experiences of being psychic, as though they're real, makes it much healthier and easier to navigate what could potentially just be false information and a mental illness. So I've been Dave Bradley, Schizophreniforms. Peace.